Section 11 of Three Soldiers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by M.B. Three Soldiers by John Dos Passos. Section 11. 3. Henslowe poured wine from a brown earthen crock into the glasses, where it shimmered a bright thin red the color of currants. Andrews leaned back in his chair and looked through half-closed eyes at the table with its white cloth and little burnt umber loaves of bread, and out of the window at the square dimly lit by lemon-yellow gas lamps, and at the dark gables of the little houses that huddled round it. At a table against the wall opposite, a lame boy, with white beardless face and gentle violet-colored eyes, sat very close to the bare-headed girl who was with him and who never took her eyes off his face, leaning on his crutch all the while. A stove hummed faintly in the middle of the room, and from the half-open kitchen door came ruddy light and the sound of something frying. On the wall, in brownish colors that seemed to have taken warmth from all the rich scents of food they had absorbed since the day of their painting, were scenes of the Butte, as it was fancied to have once been, with windmills and wide fields. "I want to travel," Henslowe was saying, dragging out his words drowsily. "Abyssinia, Patagonia, Turkestan, the Caucasus, anywhere and everywhere. What do you say you and I go out to New Zealand and raise sheep? But why not stay here? There can't be anywhere as wonderful as this. Then I'll put off starting for New Guinea for a week. But hell, I'll go crazy staying anywhere after this. It's got into my blood, all this murder. It's made a wanderer of me, that's what it's done. I'm an adventurer. God, I wish it had made me into anything so interesting. Tie a rock onto your scruples and throw 'em off the Pont Neuf and set out. Oh boy, this is the golden age for living by your wits. You're not out of the army yet. I should worry. I'll join the Red Cross. How? I've got a tip about it." A girl with an oval face and faint black down on her upper lip brought them soup, a thick greenish colored soup that steamed richly into their faces. "If you tell me how I can get out of the army, you'll probably save my life," said Andrews seriously. "There are two ways. Oh, but let me tell you later. Let's talk about something worthwhile. So you write music, do you?" Andrews nodded. An omelette lay between them, pale golden yellow with flecks of green. A few amber bubbles of burnt butter still clustered round the edges. "Talk about tone poems," said Henslowe. "But if you are an adventurer and have no scruples, how is it you are still a private?" Henslowe took a gulp of wine and laughed uproariously. "That's the joke." They ate in silence for a little while. They could hear the couple opposite them talking in low, soft voices. The stove purred, and from the kitchen came a sound of something being beaten in a bowl. Andrews leaned back in his chair. "This is so wonderfully quiet and mellow," he said. "It is so easy to forget that there's any joy at all in life." "Rot, it's a circus parade." "Have you ever seen anything drearier than a circus parade? One of those jokes that just aren't funny." "Justine, encore du vin," called Henslowe. "So you know her name?" "I live here. The Butte is the boss on the middle of the shield. It's the axle of the wheel. That's why it's so quiet, like the center of a cyclone, of a vast whirling rotary circus parade." Justine, with her red hands that had washed so many dishes, off which other people had dined well, put down before them a scarlet langouste, of which claws and feelers sprawled over the tablecloth that already had a few purplish stains of wine. The sauce was yellow and fluffy like the breast of a canary bird. "D'you know," said Andrews suddenly, talking fast and excitedly while he brushed the straggling yellow hair off his forehead, "I'd almost be willing to be shot at the end of the year if I could live up here All that time with a piano and a million sheets of music paper, it would be worth it. But this is a place to come back to. Imagine coming back here after the highlands of Tibet where you'd nearly got drowned and scalped and had made love to the daughter of an Afghan chief, who had red lips smeared with lukumi so that the sweet taste stayed in your mouth. Henslowe stroked softly his little brown mustache. But what's the use of just seeing and feeling things if you can't express them? What's the use of living at all? For the fun of it, man! Damn ends! But the only profound fun I ever have is that... Andrews's voice broke. Oh God, I would give up every joy in the world if I could turn out one page that I felt was adequate. Do you know, it's years since I've talked to anybody? They both stared silently out of the window at the fog that was packed tightly against it like cotton wool, only softer, and a greenish gold color. "The MPs sure won't get us tonight," said Henslowe, banging his fist jauntily on the table. "I've got a great mind to go to the Rue Sainte Anne and leave my card on the Provost Marshal. God damn, do you remember that man who took the bite out of our wine bottle? He didn't give a hoot in hell, did he? Talk about expression. Why don't you express that? I think that's the turning point of your career. That's what made you come to Paris. You can't deny it." They both laughed loudly, rolling about on their chairs. Andrews caught glints of contagion in the pale violet eyes of the lame boy and in the dark eyes of the girl. "Let's tell them about it," he said, laughing, with his face, bloodless after the months in the hospital, suddenly flushed. "Salut," said Henslowe, turning round and elevating his glass. "Nous rions parce que nous sommes gris de vin gris." Then he told them about the man who ate glass. He got to his feet and recounted slowly in his drawling voice with gestures. Justine stood by with a dish full of stuffed tomatoes of which the red skins showed vaguely through a mantle of dark brown sauce. When she smiled, her cheeks puffed out, and gave her face a little of the look of a white cat's. "And you live here?" asked Andrews after they had all laughed. "Always. It is not often that I go down to town. It's so difficult. I have a withered leg." He smiled brilliantly, like a child telling about a new toy. "And you?" "How could I be anywhere else?" answered the girl. "It's a misfortune, but there it is." She tapped with the crutch on the floor, making a sound like someone walking with it. The boy laughed and tightened his arm round her shoulder. "I should like to live here," said Andrews simply. "Why don't you?" "But don't you see he's a soldier?" whispered the girl hurriedly. A frown wrinkled the boy's forehead. "Well, it wasn't by choice, I suppose," he said. Andrews was silent. Unaccountable shame took possession of him before these people who had never been soldiers, who would never be soldiers. "The Greeks used to say," he said bitterly, using a phrase that had been a long time on his mind, "that when a man became a slave, on the first day he lost one half of his virtue." "When a man becomes a slave," repeated the lame boy softly, "on the first day he loses one half of his virtue." "What's the use of virtue? It is love you need," said the girl. "I've eaten your tomato, friend Andrews," said Henslowe. "Justine will get us some more." He poured out the last of the wine that half filled each of the glasses with its thin sparkle, the color of red currants. Outside the fog had blotted everything out in even darkness, which grew vaguely yellow and red near the sparsely scattered street lamps. Andrews and Henslowe felt their way blindly down the long gleaming flights of steps that led from the quiet darkness of the Butte through the confused lights and noises of more crowded streets. The fog caught in their throats and tinkled in their noses and brushed against their cheeks like moist hands. "Why did we go away from that restaurant? I'd like to have talked to those people some more," said Andrews. "We haven't had any coffee either." But, man, we're in Paris. We're not going to be here long. We can't afford to stay all the time in one place. It's nearly closing time already." "The boy was a painter. He said he lived by making toys. He whittles out wooden elephants and camels for Noah's arks. Did you hear that?" They were walking fast down a straight sloping street. Below them already appeared the golden glare of a boulevard. Andrews went on talking, almost to himself. What a wonderful life that would be to live up here in a small room that would overlook the great rosy expanse of the city. To have some absurd work like that to live on, and to spend all your spare time working and going to concerts. A quiet, mellow existence. Think of my life beside it, slaving in that iron, metallic, brazen New York to write ineptitudes about music in the Sunday paper. God! And this. They were sitting down at a table in a noisy cafe, full of yellow light flashing in eyes and on glasses and bottles, of red lips crushed against the thin, hard rims of glasses. "Wouldn't you just like to rip it off?" Andrews jerked at his tunic with both hands where it bulged out over his chest. "Oh, I'd like to make the buttons fly all over the cafe, smashing the liqueur glasses, snapping in the faces of all those dandified French officers who look so proud of themselves that they survived long enough to be victorious." "The coffee's famous here," said Henslowe. "The only place I ever had it better was at a bistro in Nice on this last permission." "Somewhere else again." "That's it. Forever and ever, somewhere else. Let's have some Prunelle. Before the war, Prunelle." The waiter was a solemn man, with a beard cut like a prime minister's. He came with the bottle held out before him, religiously lifted. His lips pursed with an air of intense application, while he poured the white glinting liquid into the glasses. When he had finished, he held the bottle upside down with a tragic gesture. Not a drop came out. "It is the end of the good old times," he said. "Damnation to the good old times," said Henslowe. "Here's to the good old new rough-housey circus parades." "I wonder how many people they are good for, those circus parades of yours," said Andrews. "Where are you going to spend the night?" said Henslowe. "I don't know. I suppose I can find a hotel or something." "Why don't you come with me and see Berthe? She probably has friends." "I want to wander about alone. Not that I scorn Berthe's friends, but I'm so greedy for solitude." John Andrews was walking alone down streets full of drifting fog. Now and then a taxi dashed past him and clattered off into the obscurity. Scattered groups of people, their footsteps hollow in the muffling fog, floated about him. He did not care which way he walked, but went on and on, crossing large crowded avenues where the lights embroidered patterns of gold and orange on the fog, rolling in wide deserted squares, diving into narrow streets where other steps sounded sharply for a second now and then, and faded, leaving nothing in his ears when he stopped still to listen but the city's distant muffled breathing. At last he came out along the river, where the fog was densest and coldest, and where he could hear faintly the sound of water gurgling past the piers of bridges. The glow of the lights glared and dimmed, as he walked along, and sometimes he could make out the bare branches of trees blurred across the halos of the lamps. The fog caressed him soothingly, and shadows kept flicking past him, giving him glimpses of smooth curves of cheeks and glints of eyes bright from the mist and darkness. Friendly, familiar people seemed to fill the fog just out of his sight. The muffled murmur of the city stirred him like the sound of the voices of friends. From the girl at the crossroads singing under her street lamp to the patrician pulling roses to pieces from the height of her litter, all the imagining of your desire. The murmur of life about him kept forming itself into long modulated sentences in his ears. Sentences that gave him by their form a sense of quiet well-being, as if he were looking at a low relief of people dancing, carved out of Parian in some workshop in Attica. Once he stopped and leaned for a long while against the moisture-beaded stern of a street lamp. Two shadows defined, as they strolled towards him, into the forms of a pale boy and a bareheaded girl, walking tightly laced in each other's arms. The boy limped a little, and his violet eyes were contracted to wistfulness. John Andrews was suddenly filled with throbbing expectation, as if those two would come up to him and put their hands on his arms and make some revelation of vast import to his life. But when he reached the full glow of the lamp, Andrews saw that he was mistaken. They were not the boy and girl he had talked to on the boot. He walked off hurriedly and plunged again into tortuous streets, where he strode over the cobblestone pavements, stopping now and then to peer through the window of a shop at the light in the rear, where a group of people sat quietly about a table under a light, or into a bar where a tired little boy with heavy eyelids and sleeves rolled up from thin, grey arms was washing glasses, or an old woman, a shapeless bundle of black clothes, was swabbing the floor. From doorways he heard talking and soft laughs. Upper windows sent yellow rays of light across the fog. In one doorway, the vague light from a lamp bracketed in the wall showed two figures, pressed into one by their close embrace. As Andrews walked past, his heavy army boots clattering loud on the wet pavement, they lifted their heads slowly. The boy had violet eyes and pale beardless cheeks. The girl was bareheaded and kept her brown eyes fixed on the boy's face. Andrews's heart thumped within him. At last he had found them. He made a step towards them, and then strode on, losing himself fast in the cool, effacing fog. Again he had been mistaken. The fog swirled about him, hiding wistful friendly faces, hands ready to meet his hands, eyes ready to take fire with his glance, lips cold with the mist, to be crushed under his lips. From the girl at the singing under her street lamp. And he walked on alone, through the drifting fog. 4. Andrews left the station reluctantly, shivering in the raw grey mist under which the houses of the village street and the rows of motor trucks and the few figures of French soldiers swathed in long formless coats showed as vague dark blurs in the confused dawnlight. His body felt flushed and sticky from a night spent huddled in the warm fetid air of an overcrowded compartment. He yawned and stretched himself and stood irresolutely in the middle of the street with his pack biting into his shoulders. Out of sight, behind the dark mass, in which a few ruddy lights glowed, of the station buildings, the engine whistled and the train clanked off into the distance. Andrews listened to its faint reverberation through the mist with a sick feeling of despair. It was the train that had brought him from Paris back to his division. As he stood shivering in the grey mist, he remembered the curious despairing reluctance he used to suffer when he went back to boarding school after a holiday. How he used to go from the station to the school by the longest road possible, taking frantic account of every moment of liberty left him. Today his feet had the same leaden reluctance as when they used to all but refuse to take him up the long sandy hill to the school. He wandered aimlessly for a while about the silent village, hoping to find a cafe where he could sit for a few minutes to take a last look at himself before plunging again into the groveling promiscuity of the army. Not a light showed. All the shutters of the shabby little brick and plaster houses were closed. With dull, springless steps he walked down the road they had pointed out to him from the RTO. Overhead the sky was brightening, giving the mist that clung to the earth in every direction ruddy, billowing outlines. The frozen road gave out a faint, hard resonance under his footsteps. Occasionally the silhouette of a tree by the roadside loomed up in the mist ahead, its uppermost branches clear and ruddy with sunlight. Andrews was telling himself that the war was over, and that in a few months he would be free in any case. What did a few months more or less matter? But the same thoughts were swept recklessly away in a blind panic that was like a stampede of wild steers within him. There was no arguing. His spirit was contorted with revolt, so that his flesh twitched and dark splotches danced before his eyes. He wondered vaguely whether he had gone mad. Enormous plans kept rising up out of the tumult of his mind and dissolving suddenly like smoke in a high wind. He would run away and, if they caught him, kill himself. He would start a mutiny in his company. He would lash all these men to frenzy by his words, so that they too should refuse to form into guns, so that they should laugh when the officers got red in the face shouting orders at them, so that the whole division should march off over the frosty hills, without arms, without flags, calling all the men of all the armies to join them, to march on singing, to laugh the nightmare out of their blood. Would not some lightning flash of vision sear people's consciousness into life again? What was the good of stopping the war if the armies continued? But that was just rhetoric. His mind was flooding itself with rhetoric that it might keep its sanity. His mind was squeezing out rhetoric like a sponge that he might not see dry madness face to face. And all the while his hard footsteps along the frozen road beat in his ears, bringing him nearer to the village where his division was quartered. He was climbing a long hill. The mist thinned about him and became brilliant with sunlight. Then he was walking in the full sun over the crest of a hill with pale blue sky above his head. Beyond him and before him were mist-filled valleys, and beyond other ranges of long hills, with reddish-violet patches of woodland glowing faintly in the sunlight. In the valley at his feet he could see, in the shadows of the hill he stood on, a church tower and a few roofs rising out of the mist, as out of water. Among the houses, bugles were blowing mess call. The jauntiness of the brassy notes ringing up through the silence was agony to him. How long the day would be. He looked at his watch. It was 7:30. How did they come to be having mess so late? The mist seemed doubly cold and dark when he was buried in it again after his moment of sunlight. The sweat was chilled on his face, and streaks of cold went through his clothes, soaked from the effort of carrying the pack. In the village street Andrews met a man he did not know and asked him where the office was. The man, who was chewing something, pointed silently to a house with green shutters on the opposite side of the street. At a desk sat Chrisfield smoking a cigarette. When he jumped up, Andrews noticed that he had a corporal's 2 stripes on his arm. "Hello, Andy." They shook hands warmly. "Are you all right now, old boy?" "Sure, I'm fine," said Andrews. A sudden constraint fell upon them. "That's good," said Chrisfield. "You're a corporal now. Congratulations." Made me more'n a month ago." They were silent. Chrisfield sat down in his chair again. "What sort of a town is this?" "It's a hell hole, this dump is, a hell hole." "That's nice." "Goin' to move soon, tell me. Army o' occupation. But I hadn't ought to have told you that. Don't tell any of the fellers." "Where's the outfit quartered?" "You won't know it. We've got 15 new men. No account, all of 'em. Second draft men." "Civilians in the town?" "You bet. Come with me, Andy, and I'll tell 'em to give you some grub at the cook shack. No, wait a minute and you'll miss the hike. Hikes every day since the goddam armistice. They sent out a general order tellin' 'em to double up on the drill." They heard a voice shouting orders outside, and the narrow street filled up suddenly with the sound of boots beating the ground in unison. Andrews kept his back to the window. Something in his legs seemed to be tramping in time with the other legs. "There they go," said Chrisfield. "Loot's with 'em today. Want some grub? If it ain't been punk since the armistice." The Y hut was empty and dark. Through the grimy window panes could be seen fields and a leaden sky full of heavy ochreous light, in which the leafless trees and the fields full of stubble were different shades of dead greyish brown. Andrews sat at the piano without playing. He was thinking how once he had thought to express all the cramped boredom of this life. The thwarted limbs regimented together lashed into straight lines, the monotony of servitude. Unconsciously as he thought of it, the fingers of one hand sought a chord, which jangled in the badly tuned piano. God, how silly, he muttered aloud, pulling his hands away. Suddenly he began to play snatches of things he knew, distorting them, willfully mutating the rhythm, mixing into them snatches of ragtime. The piano jangled under his hands, filling the empty hut with clamor. He stopped suddenly, letting his fingers slide from bass to treble, and began to play in earnest. There was a cough behind him that had an artificial, discreet ring to it. He went on playing without turning round. Then a voice said: "Beautiful, beautiful." Andrews turned round to find himself staring into a face of vaguely triangular shape with a wide forehead and prominent eyelids over protruding brown eyes. The man wore a Y.M.C.A. uniform which was very tight for him, so that there were creases running from each button across the front of his tunic. "Oh, do go on playing. It's years since I heard any Debussy." "It wasn't Debussy." "Oh, it wasn't? Anyway, it was just lovely. Do go on. I'll just stand here and listen." Andrews went on playing for a moment, made a mistake, started over, made the same mistake, banged on the keys with his fist and turned round again. "I can't play," he said peevishly. "Oh, you can, my boy, you can. Where did you learn? I would give $1,000,000 to play like that if I had it." Andrews glared at him silently. "You are one of the men just back from hospital, I presume." "Yes, worse luck." "Oh, I don't blame you. These French towns are the dullest places. Though I just love France, don't you?" The "Y" man had a faintly whining voice. "Anywhere's dull in the army." "Look, we must get to know each other real well. My name's Spencer Sheffield, Spencer B. Sheffield, and between you and me there's not a soul in the division you can talk to. It's dreadful not to have intellectual people about one. I suppose you're from New York?" Andrews nodded. So am I. You've probably read some of my things in Vain Endeavor." "What? You've never read Vain Endeavor?" "I guess you don't go round with the intellectual set. Most people often don't. Of course, I don't mean the village. All anarchists and society women there. I've never gone around with any set, and I never... Never mind, we'll fix that when we get back to New York. And now you just sit down at that piano and play me Debussy's Arabesque. I know you love it just as much as I do. But first, what's your name?" "Andrews." "Folks come from Virginia?" "Yes." Andrews got to his feet. "Then you're related to the Pendletons." "I may be related to the Kaiser for all I know." "The Pendletons, that's it. You see, my mother was a Miss Spencer from Spencer Falls, Virginia, and her mother was a Miss Pendleton. So you and I are cousins. Now isn't that a coincidence?" "Distant cousins. But I must go back to the barracks." "Come and see me any time," Spencer B. Sheffield shouted after him. "You know where, back of the shack, and knock twice so I'll know it's you." Outside the house where he was quartered, Andrews met the new top sergeant, a lean man with spectacles and a little mustache of the color and texture of a scrubbing brush. "Here's a letter for you," the top sergeant said. "Better look at the new K.P. list I've just posted." The letter was from Henslowe. Andrews read it with a smile of pleasure in the faint afternoon light, remembering Henslowe's constant drawling talk about distant places he had never been to, and the man who had eaten glass, and the day and a half in Paris. "Andy," the letter began, "I've got the dope at last. Courses begin in Paris February 15th. Apply at once to your CO to study something at University of Paris. Any amount of lies will go. Apply all pull possible via sergeants, lieutenants and their mistresses and laundresses. Yours, Henslowe." His heart thumping, Andrews ran after the sergeant, passing, in his excitement, a lieutenant without saluting him. "Look here," snarled the lieutenant. Andrews saluted and stood stiffly at attention. "Why didn't you salute me?" I was in a hurry, sir, and didn't see you. I was going on very urgent company business, sir." "Remember that just because the armistice is signed you needn't think you're out of the army. At ease." Andrews saluted. The lieutenant saluted, turned swiftly on his heel and walked away. Andrews caught up to the sergeant. "Sergeant Coffin, can I speak to you a minute?" "I'm in a hell of a hurry." "Have you heard anything about this Army Students' Corps to send men to universities here in France? Something the YMCA's getting up." "Can't be for enlisted men." "No, I ain't heard a word about it." "Do you want to go to school again?" "If I get a chance. To finish my course." "College man, are you?" "So am I. Well, I'll let you know if I get any general order about it. Can't do anything without getting a general order about it. Looks to me like it's all a bourgeois." "I guess you're right." The street was grey dark. Stung by a sense of impotence, surging with despairing rebelliousness, Andrews hurried back towards the buildings where the company was quartered. He would be late for mess. The grey street was deserted. From a window here and there, ruddy light streamed out to make a glowing oblong on the wall of a house opposite. "God damn it, if you don't believe me, go ask the lieutenant." "Look here, Toby, didn't our outfit see hotter work than any goddamn engineers?" Toby had just stepped into the cafe, a tall man with a brown bulldog face and a scar on his left cheek. He spoke rarely and solemnly, with a Maine coast Yankee twang. "I reckon so," was all he said. He sat down on the bench beside the other man, who went on bitterly. "I guess you would reckon so. Hell, man, you ditch diggers ain't in it." "Ditch diggers!" The engineer banged his fist down on the table. His lean, pickled face was a furious red. "I guess we don't dig half so many ditches as the infantry does, and when we've dug 'em we don't crawl into 'em and stay there like goddam cotton-tailed jackrabbits." "You guys don't get near enough to the front." "Like goddam cotton-tailed jackrabbits," shouted the pickle-faced engineer again, roaring with laughter. "Ain't that so?" He looked round the room for approval. The benches at the two long tables were filled with infantrymen who looked at him angrily. Noticing suddenly that he had no support, he moderated his voice. "The infantry's damn necessary, I'll admit that. But where'd you fellas be without us guys to string the barbed wire for you?" "There warn't no barbed wire strung in the Oregon forest where we was, boy. What d'you want barbed wire when you're advancin' for? Look here, I'll bet you a bottle of cognac my company had more losses than yourn did." "Tek 'em up, Joe," said Toby, suddenly showing an interest in the conversation. "All right, it's a go." "We had 15 killed and 20 wounded," announced the engineer triumphantly. "How badly wounded?" "What's that to you? Hand over the cognac?" "Like hell. We had 15 killed and 20 wounded too, didn't we, Toby?" "I reckon you're right," said Toby. "Ain't I right?" asked the other man, addressing the company generally. "Sure, goddam right," muttered voices. "Well, I guess it's all off then," said the engineer. "No, it ain't," said Toby. "Reckon up your wounded. The feller who's got the worst wounded takes the cognac. Ain't that fair?" "Sure." "We've had 7 fellers sent home already," said the engineer. "We've had 8, ain't we?" "Sure," growled everybody in the room. "How bad was they?" "2 of 'em was blind," said Toby. "Hell," said the engineer, jumping to his feet as if taking a trick at poker. "We had a guy who was sent home without arms nor legs, and 3 fellers got TB from bein' gassed." John Andrews had been sitting in a corner of the room. He got up. Something had made him think of the man he had known in the hospital who had said that was the life to make a fellow feel fit. Getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you jumped out of bed just like a cat. He remembered how the olive drab trousers had dangled, empty, from the man's chair. "That's nothing. One of our sergeants had to have a new nose grafted on." The village street was dark and deeply rutted with mud. Andrews wandered up and down aimlessly. There was only one other cafe. That would be just like this one. He couldn't go back to the desolate barn where he slept. It would be too early to go to sleep. A cold wind blew down the street and the sky was full of vague movement of dark clouds. The partly frozen mud clotted about his feet as he walked along. He could feel the water penetrating his shoes. Opposite the YMCA hut at the end of the street he stopped. After a moment's indecision he gave a little laugh and walked round to the back where the door of the Y-man's room was. He knocked twice, half hoping there would be no reply. Sheffield's whining, high-pitched voice said, "Who is it?" "Andrews." "Come right in. You're just the man I wanted to see." Andrews stood with his hand on the knob. "Do sit down and make yourself right at home." Spencer Sheffield was sitting at a little desk in a room with walls of unplaned boards and one small window. Behind the desk were piles of cracker boxes and cardboard cases of cigarettes, and in the midst of them a little opening like that of a railway ticket office, in the wall through which the Y-man sold his commodities to the long lines of men who would stand for hours waiting meekly in the room beyond. Andrews was looking round for a chair. "Oh, I just forgot. I'm sitting in the only chair," said Spencer Sheffield, laughing, twisting his small mouth into a shape like a camel's mouth, and rolling about his large protruding eyes. "Oh, that's all right. What I wanted to ask you was, do you know anything about..." "Look, do come into my room," interrupted Sheffield. "I've got such a nice sitting room with an open fire, just next to Lieutenant Bleezer, and there we'll talk about everything. I'm just dying to talk to somebody about the things of the spirit. Do you know anything about a scheme for sending enlisted men to French universities? Men who have not finished their courses." "Oh, wouldn't that be just fine? I tell you, boy, there's nothing like the U.S. government to think of things like that." "But have you heard anything about it?" "No, but I surely shall. Do you mind switching the light off? That's it. Now just follow me. Oh, I do need a rest. I've been working dreadfully hard since that Knights of Columbus man came down here. Isn't it hateful the way they try to run down the Y? Now we can have a nice long talk. You must tell me all about yourself." "But you really don't know anything about that university scheme?" "They say it begins February 15th," Andrews said in a low voice. "I'll ask Lieutenant Bleezer if he knows anything about it," said Sheffield soothingly, throwing an arm around Andrews's shoulder and pushing him in the door ahead of him. They went through a dark hall to a little room where a fire burned brilliantly in the hearth, lighting up with tongues of red and yellow a square black walnut table with two heavy armchairs with leather backs and bottoms that shone like lacquer. "This is wonderful," said Andrews involuntarily. "Romantic, I call it. Makes you think of Dickens, doesn't it? And Locksley Hall." "Yes," said Andrews vaguely. "Have you been in France long?" asked Andrews, settling himself in one of the chairs and looking into the dancing flames of the log fire. "Will you smoke?" He handed Sheffield a crumpled cigarette. "No, thanks, I only smoke special kinds. I have a weak heart. That's why I was rejected from the army. Oh, but I think it was superb of you to join as a private. It was my dream to do that, to be one of the nameless marching throng." "I think it was damn foolish, not to say criminal," said Andrews sullenly, still staring into the fire. "You can't mean that. Or do you mean that you think you had abilities which would have been worth more to your country in another position? I have many friends who felt that." "No. I don't think it's right of a man to go back on himself. I don't think butchering people ever does any good. I have acted as if I did think it did good. Out of carelessness or cowardice, one or the other. That I think bad." "You mustn't talk that way," said Sheffield hurriedly. "So you're a musician, are you?" He asked the question with a jaunty, confidential air. "I used to play the piano a little, if that's what you mean," said Andrews. "Music has never been the art I had most interest in, but many things have moved me intensely. Debussy and those beautiful little things of Nevin's, you must know them. Poetry has been more my field. When I was young, younger than you are, quite a lad. Oh, if only we could stay young. I am 32." I don't see that youth by itself is worth much. It's the most superb medium there is, though, for other things," said Andrews. "Well, I must go," he said. "If you do hear anything about that university scheme, you will let me know, won't you?" "Indeed I shall, dear boy, indeed I shall." They shook hands in jerky dramatic fashion, and Andrews stumbled down the dark hall to the door. When he stood out in the raw night air again, he drew a deep breath. By the light that streamed out from a window he looked at his watch. There was time to go to the regimental sergeant major's office before tattoo. At the opposite end of the village street from the Y.M.C.A. hut was a cube-shaped house, set a little apart from the rest in the middle of a broad lawn, which the constant crossing and recrossing of a staff of cars and trains of motor trucks had turned into a muddy morass in which the wheel tracks criss-crossed in every direction. A narrow boardwalk led from the main road to the door. In the middle of this walk Andrews met a captain and automatically got off into the mud and saluted. The regimental office was a large room that had once been decorated by wan and ill-drawn mural paintings in the manner of Puvis de Chavannes, but the walls had been so chipped and soiled by 5 years of military occupation that they were barely recognizable. Only a few bits of bare flesh and floating drapery showed here and there above the maps and notices that were tacked on the walls. At the end of the room a group of nymphs in Nile green and pastel blue could be seen emerging from under a French War Loan poster. The ceiling was adorned with an oval of flowers and little plaster cupids in low relief, which had also suffered and in places showed the laths. The office was nearly empty. The littered desks and silent typewriters gave a strange air of desolation to the gutted drawing room. Andrews walked boldly to the furthest desk, where a little red card leaning against the typewriter said, "Regimental Sergeant Major." Behind the desk, crouched over a heap of typewritten reports, sat a little man with scanty, sandy hair, who fixed up his eyes and smiled when Andrews approached the desk. "Well, did you fix it up for me?" he asked. "Fix what?" said Andrews. "Oh, I thought you were someone else." The smile left the regimental sergeant major's thin lips. "What do you want?" "Why, regimental sergeant major, can you tell me anything about a scheme to send enlisted men to colleges over here? Can you tell me who to apply to?" "According to what general orders? And who told you to come and see me about it anyway?" "Have you heard anything about it?" "No, nothing definite. I'm busy now anyway. Ask one of your own non-coms to find out about it." He crouched once more over the papers. Andrews was walking towards the door, flushing with annoyance, when he saw that the man at the desk by the window was jerking his head in a peculiar manner, just in the direction of the regimental sergeant major and then towards the door. Andrews smiled at him and nodded. Outside the door, where an orderly sat on a bench reading a torn Saturday Evening Post, Andrews waited. The hall was part of what must have been a ballroom, for it had a much scarred hardwood floor and big spaces of bare plaster framed by gilt and lavender colored mouldings, which had probably held tapestries. The partition of unplaned boards that formed other offices cut off the major part of a highly decorated ceiling, where cupids with crimson-daubed bottoms swam in all attitudes in a sea of pink and blue and lavender colored clouds, wreathing themselves coyly in heavy garlands of waxy hothouse flowers, while cornucopias spilling out squishy fruits gave Andrews a feeling of distinct insecurity as he looked up from below. "Say, are you a Kappa Mu?" Andrews looked down suddenly and saw in front of him the man who had signaled to him in the regimental sergeant major's office. "Are you a Kappa Mu?" he asked again. "No, not that I know of," stammered Andrews, puzzled. "What school did you go to?" "Harvard." "Harvard. Guess we haven't got a chapter there. I'm from Northwestern. Anyway, you want to go to school in France here if you can. So do I. Don't you want to come and have a drink?" The man frowned, pulled his overseas cap down over his forehead where the hair grew very low, and looked about him mysteriously. "Yes," he said. They splashed together down the muddy village street. "We've got 13 minutes before tattoo. My name's Walters, what's yours?" He spoke in a low voice in short staccato phrases. Andrews. Andrews, you've got to keep this dark. If everybody finds out about it, we're through. It's a shame you're not a Kappa Mu, but college men have got to stick together, that's the way I look at it." "Oh, I'll keep it dark enough," said Andrews. "It's too good to be true. The general order isn't out yet, but I've seen a preliminary circular." "What school do you want to go to?" "Sorbonne, Paris." "That's the stuff. Do you know the back room at Baboon's?" Walters turned suddenly to the left up an alley and broke through a hole in a hawthorn hedge. "A guy's got to keep his eyes and ears open if he wants to get anywhere in this army," he said. As they ducked in the back door of a cottage, Andrews caught a glimpse of a billowy line of a tile roof against the lighter darkness of the sky. They sat down on a bench built into a chimney, where a few sticks made a splutter of flames. "Monsieur Désir?" A red-faced girl with a baby in her arms came up to them. "That's Babette. Baboon, I call her," said Walters with a laugh. "Chocolat," said Walters. "That'll suit me all right. It's my treat, remember." "I'm not forgetting it. Now let's get to business. What you do is this. You write an application. I'll make that out for you on the typewriter tomorrow, and you meet me here at 8 tomorrow night, and I'll give it to you. You sign it at once and hand it in to your sergeant, see? This'll just be a preliminary application. When the order's out, you'll have to make another." The woman, this time without the baby, appeared out of the darkness of the room with a candle and two cracked bowls from which steam rose, faint primrose color in the candlelight. Walters drank his bowl down at a gulp, grunted and went on talking. "Give me a cigarette, will you? You'll have to make it out darn soon too, because once the order's out every son of a gun in the division'll be making out to be a college man. How did you get your tip?" "From a fellow in Paris." "You've been to Paris, have you?" said Walters admiringly. "Is it the way they say it is? Gee, these French are immoral. Look at this woman here. She'll sleep with a fellow soon as not. Got a baby too." "But who do the applications go into?" "To the colonel, or whoever he appoints to handle it." "You a Catholic?" "No." "Neither am I. That's the hell of it. The regimental sergeant major is." "Well?" "I guess you haven't noticed the way things run up at divisional headquarters. It's a regular cathedral. Isn't a Mason in it. But I must beat it. Better pretend you don't know me if you meet me on the street, see?" "All right." Walters hurried out of the door. Andrews sat alone, looking at the flutter of little flames about the pile of sticks on the hearth, while he sipped chocolate from the warm bowl held between the palms of both hands. He remembered a speech out of some very bad romantic play he had heard when he was very small. "About your head I fling the curse of Rome." He started to laugh, sliding back and forth on the smooth bench which had been polished by the breeches of generations warming their feet at the fire. The red-faced woman stood with her hands on her hips, looking at him in astonishment while he laughed and laughed. "Mais quelle gaieté! Mais quelle gaieté!" she kept saying. The straw under him rustled faintly with every sleepy movement Andrews made in his blankets. In a minute the bugle was going to blow and he was going to jump out of his blankets, throw on his clothes and fall into line for roll call in the black mud of the village street. It couldn't be that only a month had gone by since he had got back from hospital. No, he had spent a lifetime in this village being dragged out of his warm blankets every morning by the bugle, shivering as he stood in line for roll call, shuffling in a line that moved slowly past the cook shack, shuffling along in another line to throw what was left of his food into garbage cans, to wash his mess kit in the greasy water 100 other men had washed their mess kits in, lining up to drill, to march on along muddy roads, spattered by the endless trains of motor trucks, lining up twice more for mess, and at last being forced by another bugle into his blankets again to sleep heavily, while a smell hung in his nostrils of sweating, woolen clothing and breathed out air and dusty blankets. In a minute the bugle was going to blow to snatch him out of even these miserable thoughts and throw him into an automaton under other men's orders. Childish, spiteful desires surged into his mind. If the bugler would only die. He could picture him, a little man with a broad face and putty-colored cheeks, a small rusty mustache and bow legs, lying like a calf on a marble slab in a butcher's shop on top of his blankets. What nonsense, there were other buglers. He wondered how many buglers there were in the army. He could picture them all, in dirty little villages, in stone barracks, in towns, in great camps that served the country for miles with rows of black warehouses and narrow barrack buildings standing with their feet a little apart, giving their little brass bugles a preliminary tap, before putting out their cheeks and blowing in them and stealing 1.5 million, or was it 2 million or 3 million lives, and throwing the warm sentient bodies into coarse automatons who must be kept busy lest they grow restive, till killing time began again. The bugle blew with the last jaunty notes. A stir went through the barn. Corporal Chrisfield stood on the ladder that led up from the yard, his head on a level with the floor, shouting, "Shake it up, fellas. If a guy's late to roll call, it's KP for a week." As Andrews, while buttoning his tunic, passed him on the ladder, he whispered, "Tell me we're going to see service again, Andy. Army occupation." While he stood stiffly at attention, waiting to answer when the sergeant called his name, Andrews's mind was whirling in crazy circles of anxiety. What if they should leave before the general order came on the university plan? The application would certainly be lost in the confusion of moving the division, and he would be condemned to keep up this life for more dreary weeks and months. Would any years of work and happiness in some future existence make up for the humiliating agony of this servitude? Dismissed! He ran up the ladder to fetch his mess kit, and in a few minutes was in line again in the rutted village street, where the grey houses were just forming outlines as light crept slowly into the leaden sky, while a faint odor of bacon and coffee came to him, making him eager for food, eager to drown his thoughts in the heaviness of swiftly eaten greasy food, and in the warmth of watery coffee gulped down out of a tin-curved cup. He was telling himself desperately that he must do something, that he must make an effort to save himself, that he must fight against the deadening routine that numbed him. Later, while he was sweeping the rough board floor of the company's quarters, the theme came to him which had come to him long ago, in a former incarnation it seemed, when he was smearing windows with soap from a gritty sponge along the endless side of the barracks in the training camp. Time and time again in the past year he had thought of it, and dreamed of weaving it into a fabric of sound which would express the trudging monotony of days bowed under the yoke. Under the yoke, that would be a title for it. He imagined the sharp tap of the conductor's baton, the silence of a crowded hall, the first notes rasping bitterly upon the tense ears of men and women. But as he tried to concentrate his mind on the music, other things intruded upon it, blurred it. He kept feeling the rhythm of the Queen of Sheba slipping from the shoulders of her gaudily caparisoned elephant, advancing towards him through the moonlight, putting her hand, fantastic with rings and long gilded fingernails, upon his shoulders, so that ripples of delight at all the voluptuous images of his desire went through his whole body, making it quiver like a flame with yearning for unimaginable things. It all muddled into fantastic gibberish, into sounds of horns and trombones and double basses blown off key, while a piccolo shrilled the first bars of the Star-Spangled Banner. He stopped sweeping and looked about him dazedly. He was alone. Outside he heard a sharp voice call, "Attention!" He ran down the ladder and fell in at the end of the line under the angry glare of the lieutenant's small eyes, which were placed very close together on either side of a lean nose, black and hard, like the eyes of a crab. The company marched off through the mud to the drill field. After retreat, Andrews knocked at the door at the back of the YMCA, but as there was no reply, he strode off with a long, determined stride to Sheffield's room. In the moment that elapsed between his knock and an answer, he could feel his heart thumping. A little sweat broke out on his temples. "Why, what's the matter, boy? You look all wrought up," said Sheffield, holding the door half open and blocking, with his lean form, entrance to the room. "May I come in? I want to talk to you," said Andrews. "Oh, I suppose it'll be all right. You see, I have an officer with me." Then there was a flutter in Sheffield's voice. "Oh, do come in," he went on with sudden enthusiasm. "Lieutenant Bleezer is fond of music too. Lieutenant, this is the boy I was telling you about. You must get him to play for us. If he had the opportunities, I am sure he'd be a famous musician." Lieutenant Bleezer was a dark youth, with a hooked nose and a pince nez. His tunic was unbuttoned, and he held a cigar in his hand. He smiled, in an evident attempt to put this enlisted man at his ease. "Yes, I'm very fond of music, modern music," he said, leaning against the mantelpiece. "Are you a musician by profession?" "Not exactly." "Nearly." Andrews thrust his hands into the bottoms of his trouser pockets, and looked from one to the other with a certain defiance. "I suppose you've played in some orchestra. How is it you are not in the regimental band?" "No, except the Pirin." "The Pirin? Were you at Harvard?" Andrews nodded. "So was I." "Isn't that a coincidence?" said Sheffield. "I'm so glad I just insisted on your coming in." "What year were you?" said Lieutenant Bleezer with a faint change of tone, drawing a finger along his scant black mustache. 15. "I haven't graduated yet," said the lieutenant with a laugh. "What I wanted to ask you, Mr. Sheffield—" "Oh, my boy, you know you've known me long enough to call me Spence," broke in Sheffield. "I want to know," went on Andrews, speaking slowly, "can you help me to get put on the list to be sent to the University of Paris? I know that a list has been made out, although the general order has not come yet. I am disliked by most of the non-coms, and I don't see how I can get on without somebody's help. I simply can't go this life any longer." Andrews closed his lips firmly and looked at the ground, his face flushing. "Well, a man of your attainments certainly ought to go," said Lieutenant Bleezer with a faint tremor of hesitation in his voice. "I'm going to Oxford myself." "Trust me, my boy," said Sheffield. "I'll fix it up for you, I promise. Let's shake hands on it." He seized Andrews's hand and pressed it warmly in a moist palm. "If it's within human power, he added. "Well, I must go," said Lieutenant Bleezer, suddenly striding to the door. "I promised the Marquise I'd drop in. Goodbye. Take a cigar, won't you?" He held out 3 cigars in the direction of Andrews. "No, thank you." "Oh, don't you think the old aristocracy of France is just too wonderful? Lieutenant Bleezer goes almost every evening to call on the Marquise de Rompemouville. He says she is just too spirituelle for words. He often meets the commanding officer there." Andrews had dropped into a chair and sat with his face buried in his hands, looking through his fingers at the fire, where a few white fingers of flame were clutching intermittently at a grey beech log. His mind was searching desperately for expedients. He got to his feet and shouted shrilly: "I can't go this life any more, do you hear that? No possible future is worth all this. If I can get to Paris, all right. If not, I'll desert and damn the consequences." "But I've already promised I'll do all I can." "Well, do it now," interrupted Andrews brutally. "All right, I'll go and see the colonel and tell him what a great musician you are." "Let's go together now." "But that'll look queer, dear boy." "I don't give a damn. Come along. You can talk to him. You seem to be thick with all the officers." "You must wait till I tidy up," said Sheffield. "All right." Andrews strode up and down in the mud in front of the house, snapping his fingers with impatience, until Sheffield came out. Then they walked off in silence. "Now wait outside a minute," whispered Sheffield when they came to the white house with bare grapevines over the front where the colonel lived. After a wait, Andrews found himself at the door of a brilliantly lighted drawing room. There was a dense smell of cigar smoke. The colonel, an elderly man with a benevolent beard, stood before him with a coffee cup in his hand. Andrews saluted punctiliously. "They tell me you're quite a pianist. Sorry I didn't know it before," said the colonel in a kindly tone. "You want to go to Paris to study under this new scheme?" "Yes, sir. What a shame I didn't know before. The list of the men going is all made out. Of course, perhaps at the last minute, if somebody else doesn't go, your name can go in." The colonel smiled graciously and turned back into the room. "Thank you, Colonel," said Andrews, saluting. Without a word to Sheffield, he strode off down the dark village street towards his quarters. Andrews stood on the broad village street, where the mud was nearly dry, and a wind streaked with warmth ruffled the few puddles. He was looking into the window of the cafe to see if there was anyone he knew inside from whom he could borrow money for a drink. It was 2 months since he had had any pay, and his pockets were empty. The sun had just set on a premature spring afternoon, flooding the sky and the grey houses and the tumultuous tiled roofs with warm violet light. The faint premonition of the stirring of life in the cold earth that came to Andrews with every breath he drew of the sparkling wind stung his dull boredom to fury. It was the 1st of March, he was telling himself over and over again. The 15th of February he had expected to be in Paris, free, or half free, at least able to work. It was the 1st of March, and here he was still helpless, still tied to the monotonous wheel of routine, incapable of any real effort, spending his spare time wandering like a lost dog up and down the muddy street, from the Y.M.C.A. hut at one end of the village to the church and the fountain in the middle, and to the divisional headquarters at the other end, then back again, looking listlessly into windows, staring in people's faces without seeing them. He had given up all hope of being sent to Paris. He had given up thinking about it or about anything. The same dull irritation of despair droned constantly in his head, grinding round and round like a broken phonograph record. After looking a long while in the window of the cafe of the Brave Allié, he walked a little down the street and stood in the same position, staring into the Repos du Poilu, where a large sign, "American Spoken," blocked up half the window. 2 officers passed. His hand snapped up to the salute automatically like a mechanical signal. It was nearly dark. After a while he began to feel serious coolness in the wind, shivered, and started to wander aimlessly down the street. He recognized Walters coming towards him, and was going to pass him without speaking, when Walters bumped into him, muttered in his ear, "Come to Baboons," and hurried off with his swift businesslike stride. Andrews stood irresolutely for a while with his head bent, then went with unresilient steps up the alley, through the hole into the hedge and into Babette's kitchen. There was no fire. He stared morosely at the grey ashes until he heard Walters's voice beside him. "I've got you all fixed up." "What do you mean?" "Mean? Are you asleep, Andrews? They've cut a name off the school list, that's all. Now if you shake a leg and somebody doesn't get in ahead of you, you'll be in Paris before you know it. That's damn decent of you to come and tell me." "Here's your application," said Walters, drawing a paper out of his pocket. "Take it to the colonel. Get him to okay it, and then rush it up to the sergeant major's office yourself. They're making out travel orders now. So long." Walters had vanished. Andrews was alone again, staring at the grey ashes. Suddenly he jumped to his feet and hurried off towards headquarters. In the anteroom to the colonel's office he waited a long while, looking at his boots that were thickly coated with mud. "Those boots will make a bad impression, those boots will make a bad impression," a voice was saying over and over again inside of him. A lieutenant was also waiting to see the colonel, a young man with pink cheeks and a milky white forehead, who held his hat in one hand with a pair of khaki-colored kid gloves, and kept passing a hand over his light, well-brushed hair. Andrews felt dirty and ill-smelling in his badly fitting uniform. The sight of this perfect young man in his whipcord breeches, with his manicured nails and immaculately polished puttees, exasperated him. He would have liked to fight him, to prove that he was the better man, to outwit him, to make him forget his rank and his important air. The lieutenant had gone in to see the colonel. Andrews found himself reading a chart of some sort tacked up on the wall. There were names and dates and figures, but he could not make out what it was about. "All right, go ahead," whispered the orderly to him, and he was standing with his cap in his hand before the colonel, who was looking at him severely, fingering the papers he had on the desk with a heavily veined hand. Andrews saluted. The colonel made an impatient gesture. "May I speak to you, Colonel, about the school scheme? I suppose you've got permission from somebody to come to me?" "No, sir." Andrews's mind was struggling to find something to say. "Well, you'd better go and get it." "But, Colonel, there isn't time. The travel orders are being made out at this minute. I've heard that there's been a name crossed out on the list." "Too late." "But, Colonel, you don't know how important it is. I'm a musician by trade. If I can't get into practice again before being demobilized, I shan't be able to get a job. I have a mother and an old aunt dependent on me. My family has seen better days, you see, sir. It's only by being high up in my profession that I can earn enough to give them what they are accustomed to. And a man in your position in the world, Colonel, must know what even a few months of study in Paris mean to a pianist." The Colonel smiled. "Let's see your application," he said. Andrews handed it to him with a trembling hand. The Colonel made a few marks on one corner with a pencil. "Now if you can get that to the sergeant major in time to have your name included in the orders, well and good." Andrews saluted and hurried out. A sudden feeling of nausea came over him. He was hardly able to control a mad desire to tear the paper up. "The sons of bitches, the sons of bitches," he muttered to himself. Still he ran all the way to the square isolated building where the regimental office was. He stood panting in front of the desk that bore the little red card, Regimental Sergeant Major. The regimental sergeant major looked up at him inquiringly. "Here's an application for school at the Sorbonne, Sergeant. Colonel Wilkins told me to run up to you with it. Said he was very anxious to have it go at once." "Too late," said the regimental sergeant major. "But the colonel said it had to go in." "Can't help it." "Too late," said the regimental sergeant major. Andrews felt the room and the men in their olive drab shirt sleeves and the typewriters and the three nymphs creeping from behind the French War Loan poster whirl round his head. Suddenly he heard a voice behind him. "Is the name Andrews? John, Sarge?" "How the hell should I know?" said the regimental sergeant major. "Because I've got it in the orders already. I don't know how it got in." The voice was Walters's voice, staccato and businesslike. "Well, then why do you want to bother me about it? Give me that paper." The regimental sergeant major jerked the paper out of Andrews's hand and looked at it savagely. "All right, you leave tomorrow. A copy of the orders will go to your company in the morning," growled the regimental sergeant major. Andrews looked hard at Walters as he went out, but got no glance in return. When he stood in the air again, disgust surged up within him, bitterer than before. The fury of his humiliation made tears start in his eyes. He walked away from the village down the main road, splashing carelessly through the puddles, slipping in the wet clay of the ditches. Something within him, like the voice of a wounded man swearing, was winding in his head long strings of filthy names. After walking a long while, he stopped suddenly with his fists clenched. It was completely dark. The sky was faintly marbled by a moon behind the clouds. On both sides of the road rose the tall grey skeletons of poplars. When the sound of his footsteps stopped, he heard a faint lisp of running water. Standing still in the middle of the road, he felt his feelings gradually relax. He said aloud in a low voice several times, "You are a damn fool, John Andrews," and started walking slowly and thoughtfully back to the village. End of section 11. Of Three Soldiers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by M.B. Three Soldiers by John Dos Passos. Section 12. 5. Andrews felt an arm put round his shoulder. "I've been looking to hell and gone for you, Andy," said Chrisfield's voice in his ear, jerking him out of the reverie he had walked in. He could feel in his face Chrisfield's breath, heavy with cognac. "I'm going to Paris tomorrow, Chris," said Andrews. "I know it, boy, I know it. That's why I was that right smart to talk to you. You don't want to go to Paris. Why don't you come up to Germany with us? Tell me they live like kings up there." "All right," said Andrews. "Let's go to the back room at Babette's." Chrisfield hung on his shoulder, walking unsteadily beside him. At the hole in the hedge Chrisfield stumbled and nearly pulled them both down. They laughed, and still laughing staggered into the dark kitchen, where they found the red-faced woman with her baby sitting beside the fire with no other light than the flicker of the rare flames that shot up from a little mass of wood embers. The baby started crying shrilly when the two soldiers stamped in. The woman got up and, talking automatically to the baby all the while, went off to get a light and wine. Andrews looked at Chrisfield's face by the firelight. His cheeks had lost the faint childish roundness they had had when Andrews had first talked to him, sweeping up cigarette butts off the walk in front of the barracks at the training camp. "I tell you, boy, you ought to come with us to Germany. Nothing but whores in Paris. The trouble is, Chris, that I don't want to live like a king or a sergeant or a major general. I want to live like John Andrews." "What you gonna do in Paris, Andy?" "Study music. I guess some day I'll go into a movie show and when they turn on the lights, who'll I see but my old friend Andy ragging the scales on the pianner." "Something like that." "How do you like being a corporal, Chris?" "Oh, I don't know." Chrisfield spat on the floor between his feet. "It's funny, ain't it? You and me was right smart friends once. Guess it's being a non-com." Andrews did not answer. Chrisfield sat silent with his eyes on the fire. "Well, I got him. God, it was easy," he said suddenly. "What do you mean?" "I got him, that's all." "You mean?" Chrisfield nodded. In the Oregon forest," he said. Andrews said nothing. He felt suddenly very tired. He thought of the men he had seen in attitudes of death. "I wouldn't have thought it'd been so easy," said Chrisfield. The woman came through the door at the end of the kitchen with a candle in her hand. Chrisfield stopped speaking suddenly. "Tomorrow I'm going to Paris," cried Andrews boisterously. "It's the end of soldiering for me. I bet it'll be some sport in Germany, Andy. Sarge says we'll be going up to what's its name?" "Koblenz." Chrisfield poured a glass of wine out and drank it off, smacking his lips after it and wiping his mouth on the back of his hand. "Do you remember, Andy, we was both of us brushin' cigarette butts at that bloody training camp when we first met up with each other? Considerable water has run under the bridge since then. I reckon we won't meet up again most likely." "Hell, why not?" They were both silent again, staring at the fading embers of the fire. In the dim edge of the candlelight the woman stood with her hands on her hips, looking at them fixedly. "Reckon a fellow wouldn't know what to do with himself if he did get out of the army. Now would he, Andy?" "So long, Chris. I'm beating it," said Andrews in a harsh voice, jumping to his feet. "So long, Andy, old man. I'll pay for the drinks." Chrisfield was beckoning with his hand to the red-faced woman, who advanced slowly through the candlelight. "Thanks, Chris." Andrews strode away from the door. A cold, needle-like rain was falling. He pulled up his coat collar and ran down the muddy village street towards his quarters. 6. In the opposite corner of the compartment, Andrews could see Walters hunched up in an attitude of sleep, with his cap pulled down far over his eyes. His mouth was open and his head wagged with the jolting of the train. The shade over the light plunged the compartment into dark blue obscurity, which made the night sky outside the window and the shapes of trees and houses, evolving and pirouetting as they glided by, seem very near. Andrews felt no desire to sleep. He had sat a long time leaning his head against the frame of the window, looking out at the fleeting shadows and the occasional little red-green lights that darted by, and the glow of the stations that flared for a moment and were lost in dark silhouettes of unlighted houses and skeleton trees and black hillsides. He was thinking how all the epochs in his life seemed to have been marked out by railway rides at night. The jolting rumble of the wheels made the blood go faster through his veins, made him feel acutely the clattering of the train along the gleaming rails, spurning fields and trees and houses, piling up miles and miles between the past and future. The gusts of cold night air when he opened the window and the faint whiffs of steam and coal gas that tingled in his nostrils excited him like a smile on a strange face seen for a moment in a crowded street. He did not think of what he had left behind. He was straining his eyes eagerly through the darkness towards the vivid life he was going to live. Boredom and abasement were over. He was free to work and hear music and make friends. He drew deep breaths. Warm waves of vigor seemed flowing constantly from his lungs and throat to his fingertips and down through his body and the muscles of his legs. He looked at his watch. 1. In 6 hours he would be in Paris. For 6 hours he would sit there looking out at the fleeting shadows of the countryside, feeling in his blood the eager throb of the train, rejoicing in every mile the train carried him away from things past. Walters still slept, slipping off the seat, with his mouth open and his overcoat bundled round his head. Andrews looked out of the window, feeling in his nostrils the tingle of steam and coal gas. A phrase out of some translation of the Iliad came to his head. Ambrosial night, night ambrosial unending. But better than sitting round a campfire drinking wine and water and listening to the boastful yarns of long-haired Achaeans was this hustling through the countryside, away from the monotonous whine of past unhappiness, towards joyousness and life. Andrews began to think of the men he had left behind. They were asleep at this time of night, in barns and barracks, or else standing on guard with cold, damp feet, and cold hands which the icy rifle barrel burned when they tended it. He might go far away out of sound of the tramp of marching, away from the smell of overcrowded barracks where men slept in rows like cattle, but he would still be one of them. He would not see an officer pass him without an unconscious movement of servility. He would not hear a bugle without feeling sick with hatred. If he could only express these thwarted lives, the miserable dullness of industrialized slaughter, it might have been almost worthwhile. For him. For the others it would never be worthwhile. "But you're talking as if you were out of the woods. You're a soldier still, John Andrews." The words formed themselves in his mind as vividly as if he had spoken them. He smiled bitterly and settled himself again to watch silhouettes of trees and hedges and houses and hillsides fleeing against the dark sky. When he awoke, the sky was grey. The train was moving slowly, clattering loudly over switches, through a town of wet slate roofs that rose in fantastic patterns of shadow above the blue mist. Walters was smoking a cigarette. "God, these French trains are rotten," he said when he noticed that Andrews was awake. "The most inefficient country I ever was in, anyway." "Inefficiency be damned," broke in Andrews, jumping up and stretching himself. He opened the window. "The heating's too damned efficient. I think we're near Paris." The cold air, with a flavor of mist in it, poured into the stuffy compartment. Every breath was joy. Andrews felt a crazy buoyancy bubbling up in him. The rumbling clatter of the train wheels sang in his ears. He threw himself on his back on the dusty blue seat and kicked his heels in the air like a colt. "Liven up, for God's sake, man," he shouted. "We're getting near Paris." "We are lucky bastards," said Walters, grinning, with the cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth. "I'm going to see if I can find the rest of the gang." Andrews, alone in his compartment, found himself singing at the top of his lungs. As the day brightened, the mist lifted off the flat linden green fields intersected by rows of leafless poplars. Salmon-colored houses with blue roofs wore already a faintly citified air. They passed brick kilns and clay quarries, with reddish puddles of water in the bottom of them, crossed a jade-green river where a long file of canal boats with bright paint on their prows moved slowly. The engine whistled shrilly. They clattered through a small freight yard, and rows of suburban houses began to form, at first chaotically in broad patches of garden land, and then in orderly ranks with streets between them and shops at the corners. A dark grey dripping wall rose up suddenly and blotted out the view. The train slowed down and went through several stations crowded with people on their way to work. Ordinary people in varied clothes, with only here and there a blue or khaki uniform. Then there was more dark grey wall, and the obscurity of wide bridges under which dusty oil lamps burned orange and red, making a gleam on the wet wall above them, and where the wheels clanged loudly. More freight yards, and the train pulled slowly past other trains full of faces and silhouettes of people, to stop with a jerk in a station. And Andrews was standing on the grey cement platform, sniffing smells of lumber and merchandise and steam. His ungainly pack and blanket roll he carried on his shoulder like a cross. He had left his rifle and cartridge belt carefully tucked out of sight under the seat. Walters and 5 other men straggled along the platform towards him, carrying or dragging their packs. There was a look of apprehension on Walters's face. "Well, what do we do now?" he said. "Do!" cried Andrews, and burst out laughing. Prostrate bodies, in olive drab, hid the patch of tender green grass by the roadside. The company was resting. Chrisfield sat on a stump morosely whittling at a stick with a pocket knife. Judkins was stretched out beside him. "What the hell do they make us do this damn hikin' for, Corp?" "Guess they're skeered we'll forget how to walk." "Well, ain't it better than loafin' around your billets all day, thinkin' and cursin' and wishin' you was home?" spoke up the man who sat the other side, pounding down the tobacco in his pipe with a thick forefinger. "It makes me sick, trampin' round this way in ranks all day with the goddam frogs starin' at us and..." "They're laughin' at us, I bet," broke in another voice. "We'll be movin' soon to the army o' occupation," said Chrisfield cheerfully. "In Germany it'll be a reglar picnic." "And d'you know what that means?" burst out Judkins, sitting bolt upright. "D'you know how long the troops is goin' to stay in Germany? 15 years. God, they couldn't keep us there that long, man. They can do anythin' they goddam please with us. We're the guys as is gettin' the raw end of this deal. It ain't the same with an edicated guy like Andrews or Sergeant Coffin or them. They can suck around after Y-men and officers and get on the inside track, and all we can do is stand up and salute and say, 'Yes, Lieutenant,' or 'No, Lieutenant,' and let 'em ride us all they goddam please. Ain't that the gospel truth, Corporal?" "I guess you're right, Judkie. We gets the raw end of the stick." "That damn yeller dawg Andrews goes to Paris and gets schoolin' for free and all that." "Hell, Andy warn't yeller, Judkins." "Well, why did he go belly achin' around all the time like he knew more'n the lieutenant did?" "I reckon he did," said Chrisfield. "Anyway, you can't say that those guys who went to Paris did a goddam thing more'n any of the rest of us did. God, I ain't even had a leave yet." "Well, it ain't no use crabbin'." "No, once we get home and folks know the way we've been treated, there'll be a great ol' investigation, I can tell you that," said one of the new men. "It makes you mad though to have somethin' like that put over on you. Think of them guys in Paris havin' a hell of a time with wine and women, and we stay out here and clean our guns and drill. God, I'd like to get even with some of them guys." The whistle blew. The patch of grass became unbroken green again as the men lined up along the side of the road. "Fall in," called the sergeant. "Attention! Right dress! Front! God, you guys haven't got no snap in you. Stick your belly in, you. You know better than to stand like that. Squads right! March! Hep, hep, hep!" The company tramped off along the muddy road. Their steps were all the same length. Their arms swung in the same rhythm. Their faces were cowed into the same expression. Their thoughts were the same. The tramp, tramp of their steps died away along the road. Birds were sitting among the budding trees. The young grass by the roadside kept the marks of the soldiers' bodies. Part 5. The World Outside. 1. Andrews and 6 other men from his division sat at a table outside the cafe, opposite the Gare de l'Est. He leaned back in his chair with a cup of coffee lifted, looking across it at the stone houses with many balconies. Steam, scented of milk and coffee, rose from the cup as he sipped it. His ears were full of a rumble of traffic and a clacking of heels as people walked briskly by along the damp pavements. For a while he did not hear what the men he was sitting with were saying. They talked and laughed, but he looked beyond their khaki uniforms and their boat-shaped hats unconsciously. He was taken up with the smell of the coffee and of the mist. A little rusty sunshine shone on the table of the cafe and on the thin varnish of wet mud that covered the asphalt pavement. Looking down the avenue, away from the station, the houses, dark grey tending to greenish in the shadow and to violet in the sun, faded into a soft haze of distance. Dull gilt lettering glittered along black balconies. In the foreground were men and women walking briskly, their cheeks whipped a little into color by the rawness of the morning. The sky was a faintly roseate grey. Walters was speaking. "The first thing I want to see is the Eiffel Tower." "Why do you want to see that?" said the small sergeant with a black mustache and rings round his eyes like a monkey. "Why, man, don't you know that everything begins from the Eiffel Tower? If it weren't for the Eiffel Tower there wouldn't be any skyscrapers." "Well, how about the Flatiron Building and the Brooklyn Bridge? They were built before the Eiffel Tower, weren't they?" interrupted the man from New York. "The Eiffel Tower is the first piece of complete girder construction in the whole world," reiterated Walters dogmatically. "First thing I'm going to do's go to the Folies Bergères. Me for the W.W.'s." "Better lay off the wild women, Bill," said Walters. "I ain't goin' to look at a woman," said the sergeant with the black mustache. "I guess I seen enough women in my time anyway. The war's over anyway." "You just wait, kid, till you fasten your lamps on a real Parisienne," said a burly, unshaven man with a corporal's stripes on his arm, roaring with laughter. Andrews lost track of the talk again, staring dreamily through half-closed eyes down the long straight street, where greens and violets and browns merged into a bluish grey monochrome at a little distance. He wanted to be alone, to wander at random through the city, to stare dreamily at people and things, to talk by chance to men and women, to sink his life into the misty sparkling life of the streets. The smell of the mist brought a memory to his mind. For a long while he groped for it, until suddenly he remembered his dinner with Henslowe and the faces of the boy and girl he had talked to on the boot. He must find Henslowe at once. A second's fierce resentment went through him against all these people about him. Christ! He must get away from them all. His freedom had been hard enough won, he must enjoy it to the uttermost. "Say, I'm going to stick to you, Andy," Walters's voice broke into his reverie. "I'm going to appoint you the Corps of Interpreters." Andrews laughed. "Do you know the way to the school headquarters?" "The RTO said take the subway." "I'm going to walk," said Andrews. "You'll get lost, won't you?" "No danger, worse luck," said Andrews, getting to his feet. "I'll see you fellas at the school headquarters, whatever those are. So long." "Say, Andy, I'll wait for you there," Walters called after him. Andrews darted down a side street. He could hardly keep from shouting aloud when he found himself alone, free, with days and days ahead of him to work and think, gradually to rid his limbs of the stiff attitudes of the automaton. The smell of the streets and the mist, indefinably poignant, rose like incense smoke in fantastic spirals through his brain, making him hungry and dazzled, making his arms and legs feel lithe and as ready for delight as a crouching cat for a spring. His heavy shoes beat out a dance as they clattered on the wet pavements under his springy steps. He was walking very fast, stopping suddenly now and then to look at the greens and oranges and crimsons of vegetables in a push cart, to catch a vista down intricate streets, to look into the rich brown obscurity of a small wine shop where workmen stood at the counter sipping white wine. Oval, delicate faces, bearded faces of men, slightly gaunt faces of young women, red cheeks of boys, wrinkled faces of old women, whose ugliness seemed to have hidden in it, stirringly, all the beauty of youth and the tragedy of lives that had been lived. The faces of the people he passed moved him like rhythms of an orchestra. After much walking, turning always down the street which looked pleasantest, he came to an oval with a statue of a pompous personage on a ramping horse. Place des Victoires, he read the name, which gave him a faint tinge of amusement. He looked quizzically at the heroic features of the Sun King and walked off laughing. I suppose they did it better in those days, the grand manner, he muttered. And his delight redoubled in rubbing shoulders with the people whose effigies would never appear astride ramping-eared horses in squares built to commemorate victories. He came out on a broad, straight avenue, where there were many American officers he had to salute, and M.P.s and shops with wide plate-glass windows full of objects that had a shiny, expensive look. Another case of victories, he thought as he went off into a side street, taking with him a glimpse of the bluish-grey pile of the Opera, with its pompous windows and its naked bronze ladies holding lamps. He was in a narrow street full of hotels and fashionable barber shops, from which came an odor of cosmopolitan perfumery, of casinos and balloons and diplomatic receptions, when he noticed an American officer coming towards him, reeling a little. A tall, elderly man with a red face and a bottle nose. He saluted. The officer stopped still, swaying from side to side, and said in a whining voice: "Shawnee, do you know where Henry's bar is?" "No, I don't, Major," said Andrews, who felt himself enveloped in an odor of cocktails. "You'll help me to find it, Shawnee, won't you? It's dreadful not to be able to find it. I've got to meet Lieutenant Travers in Henry's bar." The major steadied himself by putting a hand on Andrews's shoulder. A civilian passed them. "Dis donc," shouted the major after him. "Dis donc, mon cher, où est Henry's bar?" The men walked on without answering. "Now isn't that just like a frog not to understand his own language?" said the major. "But there's Henry's bar, right across the street," said Andrews suddenly. "Bon, bon," said the major. They crossed the street and went in. At the bar the major, still clinging to Andrews' shoulder, whispered in his ear: "I'm AWOL, she? Whole damn air service is AWOL. Have a drink with me. You enlisted, man? Nobody cares here. War's over, sonny. Democracy is shafe for the world." Andrews was just raising a champagne cocktail to his lips, looking with amusement at the crowd of American officers and civilians who crowded into the small mahogany barroom, when a voice behind him drawled out: "I'll be damned." Andrews turned and saw Henslow's brown face and small silky mustache. He abandoned his major to his fate. "God, I'm glad to see you. I was afraid you hadn't been able to work it out," said Henslowe slowly, stuttering a little. "I am crazy. I'm about crazy, Henny, with delight. I just got in a couple of hours ago." Laughing, interrupting each other, they chattered in broken sentences. "But how in the name of everything did you get here?" "With the major?" said Andrews, laughing. "What the devil?" "Yes, that major," whispered Andrews in his friend's ear. "Rather the worse for wear. Asked me to lead him to Henry's bar and just fed me a cocktail in the memory of democracy, late defunct." "But what are you doing here? It's not exactly exotic." "I came to see a man who was going to tell me how I could get to Roumania with the Red Cross. But that can wait. Let's get out of here. God, I was afraid you hadn't made it." "I had to crawl on my belly and lick people's boots to do it. God, it was low. But here I am." They were out on the street again, walking and gesticulating. "But libertad, libertad, allons ma femme, as Walt Whitman would have said," shouted Andrews. Ah, but it's one grand and glorious feeling. I've been here 3 days. My section's gone home, God bless them. But what do you have to do? Do? Nothing, cried Henslowe. Not a blooming bloody goddamn thing. In fact, it's no use trying. The whole thing is such a mess you couldn't do anything if you wanted to. I want to go and talk to people at the Schola Cantorum. There'll be time for that. You'll never make anything out of music if you get serious-minded about it. Then, last but not least, I've got to get some money from somewhere. Now you're talking. Henslowe pulled a burnt leather pocketbook out of the inside of his tunic. Monaco, he said, tapping the pocketbook, which was engraved with a pattern of dull red flowers. He pursed his lips and pulled out some 100-franc notes, which he pushed into Andrews's hand. Give me one of them, said Andrews. All or none. They last about 5 minutes each. But it's so damn much to pay back. Pay it back? Heavens! Here, take it and stop your talking. I probably won't have it again, so you'd better make hay this time. I warn you, it'll be spent by the end of the week. All right. I'm dead with hunger. Let's go sit down on the boulevard and think about where we'll have lunch to celebrate Miss Libertad. Oh, but let's not call her that. Sounds like Liverpool, Andy, a horrid place. How about Freiheit? Said Andrews as they sat down in basket chairs in the reddish yellow sunlight. Treasonable! Off with your head. But think of it, man, said Andrews. The butchery's over, and you and I and everybody else will soon be human beings again. Human. All too human. No more than 18 wars going, muttered Henslowe. I haven't seen any papers for an age. How do you mean? People are fighting to beat the cats everywhere except on the Western Front, said Henslowe. But that's where I come in. The Red Cross sends supply trains to keep them at it. I'm going to Russia if I can work it. But how about the Sorbonne? Oh, the Sorbonne can go to Ballyhack. But Henny, I'm going to croak on your hands if you don't take me somewhere to get some food. Do you want a solemn place with red plush or with salmon pink brocade? Why have a solemn place at all? Because solemnity and good food go together. It's only a religious restaurant that has a proper devotion to the belly. Oh, I know, we'll go over to Brooklyn. Where? To the Rive Gauche. I know a man who insists on calling it Brooklyn. Awfully funny man. Never been sober in his life. You must meet him. Oh, I want to. It's a dog's age since I met anyone new, except you. I can't live without having a variegated crowd about, can you? You've got that right on this boulevard. Serbs, French, English, Americans, Australians, Romanians, Czechoslovaks. God, is there any uniform that isn't here? I tell you, Andy, the war's been a great thing for the people who knew how to take advantage of it. Just look at their puttees. I guess they'll know how to make a good thing of the peace, too. Oh, that's going to be the best yet. Come along. Let's be little devils and take a taxi. This certainly is the main street of Cosmopolis. They threaded their way through the crowd, full of uniforms and glitter and bright colors that moved in two streams, up and down the wide sidewalk between the cafes and the boles of the bare trees. They climbed into a taxi and lurched fast through the streets where, in the misty sunlight, grey-green and grey-violet mingled with blues and pale lights, as the colors mingle in a pigeon's breast feathers. They passed the leafless gardens of the Tuileries on one side, and the great inner courts of the Louvre, with their purple mansard roofs and their high chimneys, on the other, and saw for a second the river, dull jade green, and the plane trees splotched with brown and cream color along the quai, before they were lost in the narrow brownish grey streets of the old quarters. This is Paris. That was Cosmopolis, said Henslowe. I'm not particular just at present, cried Andrews gaily. The square in front of the Odeon was a splash of white, and the colonnade a blur of darkness as the cab swerved round the corner and along the edge of the Luxembourg, where, through the black iron fence, Many brown and reddish colors in the intricate patterns of leafless twigs opened here and there on statues and balustrades, and vistas of misty distances. The cab stopped with a jerk. "This is the Place des Medicis," said Henslowe. At the end of a slanting street looking very flat through the haze was the dome of the Pantheon. In the middle of the square between the yellow trams and the green low buses was a quiet pool, where the shadow of horizontals of the house fronts was reflected. They sat beside the window, looking out at the square. Henslowe ordered: "Remember how sentimental history books used to talk about prisoners who were let out after years in dungeons not being able to stand it and going back to their cells? Do you like Saulmoniere?" "Anything, or rather everything. But take it from me, that's all rubbish. Honestly, I don't think I've ever been happier in my life. Do you know, Henslowe, there's something in you that is afraid to be happy. Oh, don't be morbid. There's only one real evil in the world, being somewhere without being able to get away." "I ordered beer. This is the only place in Paris where it's fit to drink." "And I'm going to every bloomin' concert. Colin Lamoureux on Sunday, I know that. The only evil in the world is not being able to hear music or make it. These oysters are fit for Lucullus. Why not say fit for John Andrews and Bob Henslowe, damn it? Why the ghosts of poor old dead Romans should be dragged in every time a man eats an oyster, I don't see. We're as fine specimens as they were. I swear I shan't let any old turned to clay Lucullus outlive me, even if I've never eaten a lamprey." "And why should you eat a lamp chimney, Bob?" came a hoarse voice beside them. Andrews looked up into the round white face with large grey eyes hidden behind thick steel-rimmed spectacles. Except for the eyes, the face had a vaguely Chinese air. "Hello, Heinz." "Mr. Andrews, Mr. Heineman," said Henslowe. "Glad to meet you," said Heineman in a jovially hoarse voice. "You guys seem to be overeating, to reckon by the way things are piled up on the table." Through the hoarseness, Andrews could detect a faint Yankee twang in Heineman's voice. "You'd better sit down and help us," said Henslowe. "Sure. Do you know my name for this guy?" He turned to Andrews. "Sinbad. Sinbad was bad in Tokyo and Rome, and bad in Trinidad, and twice as bad at home." He sang the words loudly, waving a breadstick to keep time. "Shut up, Heinz, or you'll get us run out of here the way you got us run out of the Olympia that night." They both laughed. "And do you remember Monsieur Le Guy with his coat?" "Do I? God!" They laughed till the tears ran down their cheeks. Heineman took off his glasses and wiped them. He turned to Andrews. "Oh, Paris is the best yet. First absurdity, the Peace Conference and its 999 branches. Second absurdity, spies. Third, American officers AWOL. Fourth, the Seven Sisters sworn to slay." He broke out laughing again, his chunky body rolling about on the chair. "What are they?" "Three of them have sworn to slay Sinbad, and four of them have sworn to slay me. But that's too complicated to tell at lunchtime. Eighth, there are the Lady Relievers, Sinbad's specialty. Ninth, there's Sinbad—" "Oh, shut up, Heinz, you're getting me maudlin," spluttered Henslowe. "Oh, Sinbad was in bad all around," chanted Heineman. "But no one's given me anything to drink," he said suddenly in a petulant voice. "Garçon, une bouteille de Macon pour un cadet de Gascogne." "Oh, what's next? It ends with Vergogne. You've seen the play, haven't you? Greatest play going. Seen it twice sober and 7 other times." "Cyrano de Bergerac?" "Ah, that's it. Nous sommes les cadets de Gascogne, rhymes with ivrogne and sans vergogne. You see, I work in the Red Cross. You know, Sinbad, old Peterson's a brick. I'm supposed to be taking photographs of tubercular children at this minute. The noblest of my professions is that of artistic photographer. Borrowed the photographs from the Ricketts man. So I've nothing to do for 3 months and 500 francs traveling expenses. Oh, children, my only prayer is Give us this day our red workers' permit, and the Red Cross does the rest." Heineman laughed till the glasses rang on the table. He took off his glasses and wiped them with a rueful air. "So now I call the Red Cross the Cadets," cried Heineman, his voice a thin shriek from laughter. Andrews was drinking his coffee in little sips, looking out the window at the people that passed. An old woman with a stand of flowers sat on a small cane chair at the corner. The pink and yellow and blue violet shades of the flowers seemed to intensify the misty straw color and azured grey of the wintry sun and shadow of the streets. A girl in a tight-fitting black dress and black hat stopped at the stand to buy a bunch of pale yellow daisies, and then walked slowly past the window of the restaurant in the direction of the gardens. Her ivory face and slender body and her very dark eyes sent a sudden flush through Andrews's whole frame as he looked at her. The black erect figure disappeared in the gate of the gardens. Andrews got to his feet suddenly. "I have to go," he said in a strange voice. "I just remember a man was waiting for me at the school headquarters." "Let him wait." "Why, you haven't had a liqueur yet," cried Heineman. "No. But where can I meet you people later? Café de Rohan at 5, opposite the Palais Royal?" "You'll never find it." "Yes, I will," said Andrews. "Palais Royal metro station," they shouted after him as he dashed out of the door. He hurried into the gardens. Many people sat on benches in the frail sunlight. Children in bright colored clothes ran about chasing hoops. A woman paraded a bunch of toy balloons in carmine and green and purple, like a huge bunch of parti-colored grapes inverted above her head. Andrews walked up and down the alleys, scanning faces. The girl had disappeared. He leaned against a grey balustrade and looked down into the empty pond where traces of the explosion of a Bertha still subsisted. He was telling himself that he was a fool, that even if he had found her, he could not have spoken to her. Just because he was free for a day or two from the army, he needn't think that the age of gold had come back to earth. Smiling at the thought, he walked across the gardens, wandered through some streets of old houses in grey and white stucco with slate mansard roofs and faint complications of chimney pots, till he came out in front of a church with a new classic facade of huge columns that seemed toppling by their own weight. He asked a woman selling newspapers what the church's name was. "Mais monsieur, c'est Sans Sulpice," said the woman in a surprised tone. Sans Sulpice. Manon's songs came to his head, and the sentimental melancholy of 18th century Paris, with its gambling houses in the Palais Royal, where people dishonored themselves in the presence of their stern Cottonian fathers, and its billets doux written at little gilt tables, and its coaches lumbering in covered with mud from the provinces through the Porte d'Orléans and the Porte de Versailles. The Paris of Diderot and Voltaire and Jean-Jacques, with its muddy streets and its ordinaries where one ate bisques and larded pullets and souffles. A Paris full of muddy gilt magnificence, full of pompous ennui of the past and insane hope of the future. He walked down a narrow, smoky street, full of antique shops and old bookshops, and came out unexpectedly on the river opposite the statue of Voltaire. The name on the corner was Quai Malaquais. Andrews crossed and looked down for a long time at the river. Opposite, behind a lacework of leafless trees, were the purplish roofs of the Louvre, with their high peaks and their ranks and ranks of chimneys. Behind him the old houses of the quai, and the wing, topped by a balustrade with great stone urns, of a domed building of which he did not know the name. Barges were coming upstream, the dense green water spuming under their blunt bows, towed by a little black tugboat with its chimney bent back to pass under the bridges. The tug gave a thin shrill whistle. Andrews started walking downstream. He crossed by the bridge at the corner of the Louvre, turned his back on the arch Napoleon had built to receive the famous horses from St. Mark's, a pinkish pastry-like affair, and walked through the Tuileries, which were full of people strolling about or sitting in the sun, of doll-like children and nursemaids with elaborate white caps, of fluffy little dogs straining at the ends of leashes. Suddenly a peaceful sleepiness came over him. He sat down in the sun on a bench, watching, hardly seeing them, the people who passed to and fro casting long shadows. Voices and laughter came very softly to his ears above the distant stridency of the traffic. From far away he heard for a few moments notes of a military band playing a march. The shadows of the trees were faint blue-grey in the ruddy yellow gravel. Shadows of people kept passing and repassing across them. He felt very languid and happy. Suddenly he started up. He had been dozing. He asked an old man with a beautifully pointed white beard the way to Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. After losing his way a couple of times, he walked listlessly up some marble steps where a great many men in khaki were talking. Leaning against the doorpost was Walters. As he drew near, Andrews heard him saying to the man next to him: "Why, the Eiffel Tower was the first piece of complete girder construction ever built. That's the first thing a fellow who's wide awake ought to see." "Tell me the Opry's the grandest thing to look at," said the man next it. "If there's wine and women there, me for it. And don't forget the song." "But that isn't interesting like the Eiffel Tower is," persisted Walters. "Say, Walters, I hope you haven't been waiting for me," stammered Andrews. "No, I've been waiting in line to see the guy about courses. I want to start this thing right. I guess I'll see them tomorrow," said Andrews. "Say, have you done anything about a room, Andy? Let's you and me be bunkies." "All right. But maybe you don't want a room where I do, Walters." "Where's that? In the Latin Quarter? You bet. I want to see some French life while I'm about it." "Well, it's too late to get a room today." "I'm going to the Y tonight anyway." "I'll get a fellow I know to put me up. Then tomorrow we'll see." "Well, so long," said Andrews, moving away. "Wait, I'm coming with you. We'll walk around town together." "All right," said Andrews. The rabbit was rather formless, very fluffy, and had a glance of madness in its pink eye with a black center. It hopped like a sparrow along the pavement, emitting a rubber tube from its back which went up to a bulb in a man's hand, which the man pressed to make the rabbit hop. Yet the rabbit had an air of organic completeness. Andrews laughed inordinately when he first saw it. The vendor, who had a basket full of other such rabbits on his arm, saw Andrews laughing and drew timidly near to the table. He had a pink face with little sensitive lips rather like a real rabbit's, and large frightened eyes of a wan brown. "Do you make them yourself?" asked Andrews, smiling. The man dropped his rabbit on the table with a negligent air. "Oh oui, monsieur, d'après la nature." He made the rabbit turn a somersault by suddenly pressing the bulb hard. Andrews laughed and the rabbit man laughed. "Think of a big strong man making his living that way," said Walters, disgusted. "I do it all, de matière première au profit de l'accapareur," said the rabbit man. "Hello, Andy. Late as hell. I'm sorry," said Henslowe, dropping down into a chair beside them. Andrews introduced Walters. The rabbit man took off his hat, bowed to the company and went off, making the rabbit hop before him along the edge of the curbstone. "What's happened to Heineman?" "Here he comes now," said Henslowe. An open cab had driven up to the curb in front of the cafe. In it sat Heineman, with a broad grin on his face, and beside him a woman in a salmon-colored dress, ermine furs, and an emerald green hat. The cab drove off, and Heineman, still grinning, walked up to the table. "Where's the lion cub?" asked Henslowe. "They say it's got pneumonia." "Mr. Heineman? Mr. Walters." The grin left Heineman's face. He said, "How do you do?" curtly, cast a furious glance at Andrews, and settled himself in a chair. The sun had set. The sky was full of lilac and bright purple and carmine. Among the deep blue shadows lights were coming on, primrose-colored street lamps, violet arc lamps, ruddy sheets of light poured out of shop windows. "Let's go inside, I'm cold as hell," said Heineman crossly, and they filed in through the revolving door, followed by a waiter with their drinks. "I've been in the Red Cross all afternoon, Andy. I think I am going to work that Roumania business. Want to come?" said Henslowe in Andrews's ear. "If I can get hold of a piano and some lessons and the concerts keep up, you won't be able to keep me away from Paris with wild horses." "No, sir, I want to see what Paris is like. It's going to my head so, it'll be weeks before I know what I think about it." "Don't think about it. Drink," growled Heineman, scowling savagely. "That's two things I'm going to keep away from in Paris, drink and women, and you can't have one without the other," said Walters. "True enough, you sure do need them both," said Heineman. Andrews was not listening to their talk. Twirling the stem of his glass of vermouth in his fingers, he was thinking of the Queen of Sheba slipping down from the shoulders of her elephant, glistening fantastically with jewels in the light of crackling, resinous torches. Music was seeping up through his mind as the water seeps into a hole in the sand of the seashore. He could feel all through his body the tension of rhythms and phrases taking form, not quite to be seized as yet, still hovering on the borderland of consciousness. From the girl at the crossroads singing under her street lamp, to the patrician pulling roses to pieces from the height of her litter. All the imaginings of your desire. He thought of the girl with skin like old ivory that he had seen in the Place des Medicis. The Queen of Sheba's face was like that now in his imaginings, quiet and inscrutable. A sudden cymbal clanging of joy made his heart thump hard. He was free now of the imaginings of his desire, to loll all day at cafe tables watching the tables move in changing patterns before him, to fill his mind and body with the reverberation of all the rhythms of men and women moving in the frieze of life before his eyes. No more like wooden automatons knowing only the motions of the drill manual, but supple and varied, full of force and tragedy. "For heaven's sake, let's beat it from here. Gives me a pain, this place does." Heineman beat his fist on the table. "All right," said Andrews, getting up with a yawn. Henslowe and Andrews walked off, leaving Walters to follow them with Heineman. "We're going to dine at Le Rat qui Danse," said Henslowe. "An awfully funny place." "We just have time to walk there comfortably with an appetite." They followed the long dimly lighted Rue de Richelieu to the Boulevard, where they drifted a little while with the crowd. The glaring lights seemed to powder the air with gold. Cafes and the tables outside were crowded. There was an odor of vermouth and coffee and perfume and cigarette smoke, mixed with the fumes of burnt gasoline from taxicabs. "Isn't this mad?" said Andrews. "It's always carnival at 7 on the Grand Boulevard." They started climbing the steep streets to Montmartre. At the corner they passed a hard-faced girl with rouge-smeared lips and over-powdered cheeks, laughing on the arm of an American soldier who had a sallow face and dull green eyes that glittered in the slanting light of a street lamp. "Hello, Stein," said Andrews. "Who's that?" "A fellow from our division. Got here with me this morning." "He's got curious lips for a Jew," said Henslowe. At the fork of two slanting streets they went into a restaurant that had small windows pasted over with red paper, through which the light came dimly. Inside were crowded oak tables and oak wainscoting with a shelf round the top, on which were shell cans, a couple of skulls, several cracked majolica plates, and a number of stuffed rats. The only people there were a fat woman and a man with long grey hair and a beard who sat talking earnestly over two small glasses in the center of the room. A husky looking waitress with a Dutch cap and apron hovered near the inner door, from which came a great smell of fish frying in olive oil. "The cook's here from Marseilles," said Henslowe as they settled themselves at a table for four. "I wonder if the rest of them lost the way," said Andrews. "More likely old Heinz stopped to have a drink," said Henslowe. "Let's have some hors d'oeuvre while we are waiting." The waitress brought a collection of boat-shaped plates of red salads and yellow salads and green salads, and two little wooden tubs with herrings and anchovies. Henslowe stopped her as she was going, saying, "Rien de plus?" The waitress contemplated the array with a tragic air, her arms folded over her ample bosom. "Que voulez-vous, monsieur? C'est l'armistice." "The greatest fake about all this war business is the peace. I tell you, not till the hors d'oeuvre has been restored to its proper abundance and variety will I admit that the war is over." The waitress tittered. "Things aren't what they used to be," she said, going back into the kitchen. Heineman burst into the restaurant at that moment, slamming the door behind him so that the glass rang, and the fat woman and the hairy man started violently in their chairs. He tumbled into a place, grinning broadly. "And what have you done to Walters?" Heineman wiped his glasses meticulously. "Oh, he died of drinking raspberry shrub," he said. "Dis donc petit vin de Bourgogne," he shouted towards the waitress in his nasal French. Then he added, "Le Guy is coming in a minute. I just met him." The restaurant was gradually filling up with men and women of very various costumes, with a good sprinkling of Americans in uniform and out. "God, I hate people who don't drink," cried Heineman, pouring out wine. "A man who doesn't drink just cumbers the earth." "How are you going to take it in America when they have prohibition?" "Oh, don't talk about it. Here's Le Guy. I wouldn't have him know I belong to a nation that prohibits good liquor. Monsieur Le Guy, Monsieur Henslowe, and Monsieur Andrews," he continued, getting up ceremoniously. A little man with twirled mustaches and a small Vandyke beard sat down at the fourth place. He had a faintly red nose and little twinkling eyes. "How glad I am," he said, exposing his starched cuffs with a curious gesture, "to have someone to dine with. When one begins to get old, loneliness is impossible. It is only youth that dares think. Afterwards one has only one thing to think about: old age." "There's always work," said Andrews. "Slavery. Any work is slavery. What is the use of freeing your intellect if you sell yourself again to the first bidder?" "Rot," said Heineman, pouring out from a new bottle. Andrews had begun to notice the girl who sat at the next table, in front of a pale young soldier in French blue, who resembled her extraordinarily. She had high cheekbones and a forehead in which the modelling of the skull showed through the transparent, faintly olive skin. Her heavy chestnut hair was coiled carelessly at the back of her head. She spoke very carefully and pressed her lips together when she smiled. She ate quickly and neatly like a cat. The restaurant had gradually filled up with people. The waitress and the patron, a faint man with a wide red sash coiled tightly round his waist, moved with difficulty among the crowded tables. A woman at a table in the corner, with white dead skin and drugged staring eyes, kept laughing hoarsely, leaning her head in a hat with bedraggled white plumes against the wall. There was a constant jingle of plates and glasses, and an oily fume of food and women's clothes and wine. "Do you want to know what I really did with your friend?" said Heineman, leaning towards Andrews. "I hope you didn't push him into the Seine." "It was damn impolite, but hell, it was damn impolite of him not to drink. No use wasting time with a man who don't drink. I took him into a cafe and asked him to wait while I telephoned. I guess he's still waiting. One of the whoriest cafes on the whole boulevard Clichy." Heineman laughed uproariously and started explaining it in his nasal French to Monsieur Le Guy. Andrews flushed with annoyance for a moment, but soon started laughing. Heineman had started singing again. "Oh, Sinbad was in bad in Tokyo and Rome, in bad in Trinidad, and twice as bad at home. Oh, Sinbad was in bad all around." Everybody clapped. The white-faced woman in the corner cried, "Bravo! Bravo!" in a shrill nightmare voice. Heineman bowed, his big grinning face bobbing up and down like the face of a Chinese figure in porcelain. "Lui est Sinbad," he cried, pointing with a wide gesture towards Henslowe. "Give 'em some more, Heinz, give them some more," said Henslowe, laughing. "Big brunettes with long stellettes on the shores of Italy, Dutch girls with golden curls beside the Zuyder Zee." Everyone cheered again. Andrews kept looking at the girl at the next table, whose face was red from laughter. "Oh, qu'il est drole, celui-là! Oh, qu'il est drole!" Heineman picked up a glass and waved it in the air before drinking it off. Several people got up and filled it from their bottles with white wine and red. The French soldier at the next table pulled an army canteen from under his chair and hung it round Heineman's neck. Heineman, his face crimson, bowed to all sides, more like a Chinese porcelain figure than ever, and started singing in all solemnity this time. "Hulas and hulas would pucker up their lips, he fell for their ball-bearing hips, for they were pips." His chunky body swayed to the ragtime. The woman in the corner kept time with long white arms raised above her head. "Bet she's a snake charmer," said Henslowe. "Oh, wild woman loved that child, he could drive 10 women wild, oh, Sinbad was in bad all around." Heineman waved his arms, pointed again to Henslowe, and sank into his chair saying in the tones of a Shakespearean actor, "C'est lui, Sinbad." The girl hid her face on the tablecloth, shaken with laughter. Andrews could hear a convulsed little voice saying, "Oh, qu'il est rigolo." Heineman took off the canteen and handed it back to the French soldier. "Merci, camarade," he said solemnly. "Eh bien, Jeanne, c'est temps de ficher le camp," said the French soldier to the girl. They got up. He shook hands with the Americans. Andrews caught the girl's eye and they both started laughing convulsively again. Andrews noticed how erect and supple she walked as his eyes followed her to the door. Andrews's party followed soon after. "We've got to hurry if we want to get to the Lapin Agile before closing. And I've got to have a drink," said Heineman, still talking in his stagey Shakespearean voice. "Have you ever been on the stage?" asked Andrews. "What stage, sir? I am in the last stages now, sir. I am an artistic photographer and none other. Moki and I are going into the movies together when they decide to have peace." "Who's Moki?" "Moki Hadj is the lady in the salmon-colored dress," said Henslowe in a loud stage whisper in Andrews's ear. "They have a lion cub named Boo Boo." "Our firstborn," said Heineman with a wave of the hand. The streets were deserted. A thin ray of moonlight, bursting now and then through the heavy clouds, lit up low houses and roughly cobbled streets, and the flights of steps with rare dim lamps bracketed in house walls that led up to the Butte. There was a gendarme in front of the door at the Lapin Agile. The street was full of groups that had just come out, American officers and YMCA women, with a sprinkling of the inhabitants of the region. "Now look, we're late," groaned Heineman in a tearful voice. "Never mind, Heinz," said Henslowe. "Le Guy'll take us to see de Clocheville like he did last time. N'est-ce pas, Le Guy?" Then Andrews heard him add, talking to a man he had not seen before, "Come along, Aubrey. I'll introduce you later." They climbed further up the hill. There was a scent of wet gardens in the air, entirely silent except for the clatter of their feet on the cobbles. Heineman was dancing a sort of jig at the head of the procession. They stopped before a tall cadaverous house and started climbing a rickety wooden stairway. "Talk about inside dope. I heard this from a man who's actually in the room when the peace conference meets." Andrews heard Aubrey's voice with a Chicago burr in the R's, behind him on the stairs. "Fine, let's hear it," said Henslowe. "Did you say the peace conference took dope?" shouted Heineman, whose puffing could be heard as he climbed the dark stairs ahead of them. "Shut up, Heinz." They stumbled over a raised doorstep into a large garret room with a tile floor, where a tall, lean man in a monastic looking dressing gown of some brown material received them. The only candle made all their shadows dance fantastically on the slanting white walls as they moved about. One side of the room had three big windows, with an occasional cracked pane mended with newspaper, stretching from floor to ceiling. In front of them were two couches with rugs piled on them. On the opposite wall was a confused mass of canvases piled one against the other, leaning helter-skelter against the slanting wall of the room. C'est le bon vin, c'est la chanson du vin, chanted Heinemann. Everyone settled themselves on couches. The lanky man in the brown dressing gown brought a table out of the shadow, put some black bottles and heavy glasses on it, and drew up a camp stool for himself. "He lives that way. They say he never goes out. Stays here and paints, and when friends come in he feeds them wine and charges them double," said Henslowe. "That's how he lives." The lanky man began taking bits of candle out of a drawer of the table and lighting them. Andrews saw that his feet and legs were bare below the frayed edge of the dressing gown. The candlelight lit up the men's flushed faces and the crude banana yellows and arsenic greens of the canvases along the walls, against which jars full of paint brushes cast blurred shadows. "I was going to tell you, Henny," said Aubrey, "the dope is that the President's going to leave the conference, going to call them all damn blackguards to their faces and walk out, with the band playing the Internationale." "God, that's news," cried Andrews. "If he does that he'll recognize the Soviets," said Henslowe. "Me for the first Red Cross mission that goes to save starving Russia. Gee, that's great. I'll write you a postal from Moscow, Andy, if they haven't been abolished as delusions of the bourgeoisie." "Hell no. I've got $500 worth of Russian bonds that girl Vera gave me. But worth 5 million, 10 million, 50 million if the Czar gets back. I'm backing the little white father," cried Heinemann. "Anyway, Moki says he's alive. That Savarov's got him locked up in a suite in the Ritz. And Moki knows. Moki knows a damn lot, I'll admit that," said Henslowe. "But just think of it," said Aubrey. "That means world revolution with the United States at the head of it. What do you think of that?" "Moki doesn't think so," said Heinemann. "And Moki knows." "She just knows what a lot of reactionary warlords tell her," said Aubrey. "This man I was talking with at the Crillon, I wish I could tell you his name. Heard it directly from... well, you know who." He turned to Henslowe, who smiled knowingly. "There's a mission in Russia at this minute making peace with Lenin." "A goddamn outrage," cried Heinemann, knocking a bottle off the table. The lanky man picked up the pieces patiently without comment. "The new era is opening, men, I swear it is," began Aubrey. "The old order is dissolving. It is going down under a weight of misery and crime. This will be the first great gesture towards a newer and better world. There is no alternative. The chance will never come back. It is either for us to step courageously forward or slip into unbelievable horrors of anarchy and civil war. Peace or the Dark Ages again." Andrews had felt for some time an uncontrollable sleepiness coming over him. He rolled himself in a rug and stretched out on the empty couch. The voices arguing, wrangling, enunciating emphatic phrases, dinned for a minute in his ears. He went to sleep. When Andrews woke up, he found himself staring at the cracked plaster of an unfamiliar ceiling. For some moments he could not guess where he was. Henslowe was sleeping wrapped in another rug on the couch beside him. Except for Henslowe's breathing there was complete silence. Floods of silvery grey light poured in through the wide windows, behind which Andrews could see a sky full of bright dove-colored clouds. He sat up carefully. Sometime in the night he must have taken off his tunic and boots and puttees, which were on the floor beside the couch. The tables with the bottles had gone, and the lanky man was nowhere to be seen. Andrews went to the window in his stockinged feet. Paris way, a slate grey and dove color lay spread out like a Turkish carpet, with a silvery band of mist where the river was, out of which the Eiffel Tower stood up like a man waiting. Here and there blue smoke and brown spiraled up to lose itself in the faint canopy of brown fog that hung high above the houses. Andrews stood a long while, leaning against the window frame, until he heard Henslow's voice behind him. "Depuis le jour où je me suis donné." "You look like Louise." Andrews turned round. Henslow was sitting on the edge of the bed with his hair in disorder, combing his little silky mustache with a pocket comb. "Gee, I have a head," he said. "My tongue feels like a nutmeg grater. Doesn't yours?" "No, I feel like a fighting cock." "What do you say we go down to the Seine and have a bath in Benny Franklin's bathtub?" "Where's that? It sounds grand." "Then we'll have the biggest breakfast ever." "Oh, that's the right spirit. Where's everybody gone to?" "Old Heinz has gone to his Moki, I guess, and Aubrey's gone to collect more dope at the Crillon. He says 4 a.m, when the drunks come home, is the prime time for a newspaper man." "And the monkish man?" "Search me." The streets were full of men and girls hurrying to work. Everything sparkled, had an air of being just scrubbed. They passed bakeries from which came a rich smell of fresh baked bread. From cafes came whiffs of roasting coffee. They crossed through the markets that were full of heavy carts lumbering to and fro, and women with net bags full of vegetables. There was a pungent scent of crushed cabbage leaves and carrots and wet clay. The mist was raw and biting along the quai, and made the blood come into their cheeks and their hands stiff with cold. The bathhouse was a huge barge with a house built on it in a lozenge shape. They crossed to it by a little gangplank on which were a few geraniums in pots. The attendant gave them 2 rooms side by side on the lower deck, painted grey, with steamed over windows, through which Andrews caught glimpses of hurrying green water. He stripped his clothes off quickly. The tub was of copper varnished with some white metal inside. The water flowed in through 2 copper swans' necks. When Andrews stepped into the hot green water, a little window in the partition flew open and Henslow shouted into him: "Talk about modern conveniences! You can converse while you bathe." Andrews scrubbed himself jauntily with a square piece of pink soap, splashing the water about like a small boy. He stood up and lathered himself all over, and then let himself slide into the water, which splashed out over the floor. "D'you think you're a performing seal?" shouted Henslow. "It's all so preposterous," cried Andrews, going off into convulsions of laughter. "She has a lion cub named Boo Boo, and Nicholas Romanoff lives in the Ritz, and the revolution is scheduled for day after tomorrow at 12 noon." "I'd put it about the 1st of May," answered Henslow amid a sound of splashing. "Gee, it'd be great to be a people's commissary. You could go and revolute the Grand Lama of Tibet." "Oh, it's too deliciously preposterous," cried Andrews, letting himself slide a second time into the bathtub. Section 12